Welcome, students. I'm Anthony Gariavo from the School of Hospitality, Tourism and Travel Management. From the Department of, I'm from the Department of Travel and Tourism Management. Today, we shall we shall be looking at Herpetology I, whose code is CHT1311. So in today's lesson, we shall look at amphibian conservation. And the first things that we need to look at are the objectives. Which are the objectives that we shall explore as we go through this topic today? Number one, we shall look at the meaning of conservation. And then we shall look at the approaches that are used in the conservation of species. And then we shall look at the list of the example of amphibians with respect to the conservational status. Now, what is the meaning of conservation? So conservation is a process. When I say a process, it's all about involves various kind of parties or stakeholders. Like I know, for example, in Kenya, if we talk about conservation, what comes into our mind is there's the government of Kenya versus Kenya Wildlife Service, as well as Kenya Forestry Services. They normally work together, but what are they working together to do? One, they normally work together to ensure that we have protection and preservation of flora and fauna, so that at the end of it all in future, this flora and fauna, they can be there for future pride or posterity and for future use. Now, if you look at amphibian conservation, if you narrow down to amphibian conservation, we are now looking at the protection. It's a process that involves protection and preservation of amphibian species, so that in future they can be there, and in future you can have pride that are there. That is for future posterity. Now we shall explore the three approaches used in conservation, and the first approach is number one, the use of conventions or international agreements, and then the use of wildlife legislations. This automatically comes in the use of the law, and then we shall look at institutional frameworks, the use of institutions. Like I know earlier on I've mentioned Kenya Wildlife Service. Automatically that is an approach that is used. Even today, our institutions, our learning institutions become partisan in contribution of the process of conservation of these species that we have today. So let's look at the first approach, the use of conventions or the use of international agreements. So from what you have seen, basing on conventions, conventions are also referred to international agreements, or you can talk about treaties. Now, if I talk about treaties, it's all about people coming together and then they're signing. They come up with various kind of guidelines which they sign, they become partisan and accept to participate and ensure that they implement what they see or what they've discussed with respect to conservation. And through these international agreements, we have, we shall discuss the four important conventions that automatically get towards amphibian conservation. We have number one, Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. Now this Convention on Biological Diversity, it gives guidelines. It's a treaty or agreement that guides on how the biological diversity are supposed to be used, how they're supposed to be shared, and in the process to be conserved, so that at the end of it all, you know, the misuse of these biological resources. Now, if I talk about biological diversity, it can be in terms of the good kind of gene pool of the species, or I can talk about a super kind of a gene of which becomes important in the nation, for example. So this is now where the Convention on Biological Diversity came in, so that it can give good kind of good use, good kind of sharing, and then good kind of conservation of this biological diversity. Now, why am I saying use, sharing, and conservation? It is simply because we have some resources that are normally important, that they normally bring in foreign exchange, and of which whatever that comes out, the produce that is sold from this kind of resources, it can also aid and help the community that is near that kind of a resource. Now, we also have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, that is the CITES. This is a very, very important convention, And this automatically it was established to ensure that the international trade in specimen, that is the wild animals and plant specimen, is normally regulated to the point where it does not cause a threat to the survival. And then you have a convention on the conservation of migratory species of wild animals. Now this, from what this convention is all about, what is this all about? It's all about how to conserve and ensure that the ranges where these species migrate, they pass the normal use, or the corridors they normally use, it is automatically conserved, as well as this conserves the life in the process. And then you have Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, or also called the Ramsar Convention. Now the Ramsar Convention is a convention that was established to ensure that while we have wetlands, the resources are used wisely with a lot of conservation. And then you find that whatever that comes out of the produce automatically becomes important to the community around. So it's all about proper use, conservation of wetland resources, as well as looking at the benefits of these produces to the community around that kind of a resource. Now, I felt I should mention in Kenya, which are the examples of Ramsar sites in Kenya. Now, the first one is Lake Baringo, and then we have Lake Bogoria, Lake Elementaita, Lake Naivasha, Lake Nakuru, and then you have the Tana River Delta. All of these Ramsar sites become important simply because they support amphibians in them, since they are wetlands. And one aspect is amphibians cannot survive without wetlands because they normally prefer water bodies to be a medium where they normally reproduce, and a medium through which also the young ones also develop. So those are the Ramsar sites in Kenya. So number two approach is use of wildlife legislation. I talk about the law. The law becomes important. And one thing about the law can play a role of conservation either directly or indirectly, like in form of directives, for example. So these legislations can be they're normally shown through the presence of the laws and the policies that we have. And these policies and laws normally gear towards wildlife management. And this in Kenya, for example, you find that these laws and policies governing wildlife can be seen, or they can be they're normally found through various kind of mediums. One, we have the national development plans, sessional papers. We have official economic survey papers telling us about the gazettement of areas that have these types of wildlife, or talk about flora and fauna. And then we have presidential and ministerial statements. They can have a decree, for example. This automatically aids to give out a directive on how this flora and fauna can be conserved. And then we also have acts of parliaments. We also have acts of parliaments, acts. So these acts of parliaments can also be discussed, and then at the end of it all, if they're appropriate, they're normally passed, and then given a sign is normally put by the president so that it can endorse for this to become implemented. Now, one aspect about legislation, I've said they normally contribute either directly or indirectly. Like a good example is in the case of the late Jomo Kenyatta, who gave out a decree about Amboseli. And this man declared, because Amboseli was one kind of an ecosystem that was very critical, so he had to come out clear and say that this automatically it will become a national park, so that strict conservation of this fragile ecosystem can be implemented. So also presidential decrees become normally important in conservation. So which are the examples of very, very important legislative work that's normally important? One, we have the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act. This was enacted in 1976. And one aspect about this act, well, this act, was it established? One, it was to give guidelines on the minister responsible for wildlife so that he might clearly come up with areas that need to be gazetted as national parks or reserve or in short, I can talk about protected areas for the conservation of wildlife management. And I'll say this, this Wildlife Act also gave the minister responsible for that power to declare national parks as well as national reserves. But at the same time, it also aided also in the creation of marine national parks and reserves in the process, simply because different types of fauna automatically occupy different types of habitats. And that is why this act became important for that, for the establishment of protected areas, be it marine, be it terrestrial. They are normally important for the conservation of fauna, and amphibians included. Especially in talk about marine, I'm very sure amphibians get a benefit from that kind of an act. So one aspect about this Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, it also became an act that is gave directive on the aspects about the purposes that promote conservation of these wildlife in the parks and the reserves, and this automatically it tried to justify in terms of purposes, in terms of research, in terms of tourism promotion, and that's why this act became important to ensure that these fauna and flora are preserved. And then through this act, when it was amended this act was amended in 1999, and also through this act we are seeing the creation of a parastatal called the Kenya Wildlife Service, and this automatically was given the mandate to manage and protect the protected areas. These are the talk about the national parks and game reserves on behalf of the national government. You have number 2, the Environmental Management and Coordination Act. That is the EMCA, and the EMCA, it was enacted in 1999 and it came into operation in 2000. And one aspect about Environmental Management Coordination Act, it is one act that led to the establishment of NEMA, the National Environmental Management Authority, which automatically has the mandate or the function of setting laws, talk about policies and procedures that automatically will aid in environmental protection and biodiversity conservation. Now, if you look at, for example, in section 50 of the Act, that is the EMCA, you find that it highlights issues about ex situ and issues about in situ. What is the meaning of in situ and ex situ? In situ simply means conservation. This is a conservation approach. In situ is conservation approach where wildlife is managed within the areas where they are normally found in the natural habitats. Like, for example, managing maybe amphibians that are found in the national parks and in the national reserves, that is in situ conservation. And then it also looked at conservation of the ex situ approach of conservation, where ex situ is all about to manage or to conserve this fauna, but outside their natural habitat where they're normally found. So that is ex situ. So one aspect about the Environmental Management and Coordination Act approach is all about, it looks at laws that aid environmental protection and biodiversity conservation in terms of ex situ and in terms of in situ approach. Like if you look at section 50, it's all about looking at the 51 biodiversity in terms of 51 with talk about in situ, and then 52 ex situ, and then 53 access to genetic resources. So it's all about these areas where this biodiversity are found. It's all about, it normally emphasizes about their conservation. So one aspect about EMCA, EMCA or Environmental Management and Coordination Act is normally important simply because it highlights on environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment, meaning what? Before projects are done, maybe building or anything that is done near places of biodiversity, it has to undergo through environmental impact assessment so that it cannot also affect the human life in the process. And then you have the Forest Act. The Forest Act was enacted in 2005. And one aspect about the Forest Act, why was it established? It was established to provide good kind of guidelines so that we can have development, sustainable management, and then we have conservation and proper utilization of what? Of the forest resource. So it is focusing on the forest. How best can they be established? How best can they be developed? How best can they be sustained? And then how best can they be conserved? But at the end of it all, their benefits to us accrue in a way that we don't cause harm to these forests. So that is where the Forest Act was established. And one aspect is that the commencement date of the Forest Act was 1st February 2007. And the Forest Act, the guidelines of the Forest Act automatically was to give the power the minister in charge to declare or to establish forests and to declare an area or a protected area a forest or a nature reserve for the conservation of the forest. And then through this act, this is where we have the establishment of the Kenya Forest Services, the KFS, and this was given the mandate to ensure it comes with policies and guidelines regarding the management. And then it is to ensure that you have conservation and utilization of forest, as well as also increasing the forest cover. And I know through this forest management, I can say that the amphibians get the habitats conserved, simply because there are some that are normally arboreal, they normally are found on the forests. So through the protection of the forest, automatically, this directly automatically aids to protect the habitat, and then it protects the amphibians in the process. So it's all about protecting the forest and then promoting forest education and even doing forestry training programs to the students that may have the passion to learn more about forest and about forest conservation. So the third approach is the use of institution. Talk about institutional approach in conservation. And also the learning institutions are also they're also involved. But which are the institutions that I'm going to focus on? Number one, Kenya Wildlife Service. The Kenya Wildlife Service. So we have seen it was established under the Wildlife Act. And which are the roles of Kenya Wildlife Service? Role number one of the Kenya Wildlife Service is policy formulation about conservation, as well as the implementation. So they formulate the policies as well as ensuring that they become implemented. And then they ensure that we have the management and utilization of flora and fauna in the various habitats where they're found. And then they're the chief advisors of the government concerning establishment of protected areas. Which are these? The national parks, national reserves, even the sanctuaries that we have in Kenya. They're the ones who advise the government on how these need to be established, or if there's any kind of a need, automatically they normally advise the governments. They manage national parks and national reserves. They ensure that there's protection, enough security. And then they also prepare and implement management plans for national parks and national reserves. And then the most important aspect, and I've seen this today in Kenya Wildlife Service, they normally use advertisement so that they can tell Kenyans and even other tourists about what to find in particular kind of protected areas. That is, they normally advertise and they display what type of flora and fauna do they expect, or what type of attractions that do they expect to find in a particular kind of habitat. So what they normally do, they normally display fauna and flora in the natural state so that they can promote tourism, as well as market the country, and in the process also bring in the aspect about education. I know today what Kenya Wildlife Service does these days is all about, they normally brand these national parks so that they can tell the citizens in Kenya, even the tourists, of what they expect to find. For example, if I may pick example of if I may pick an example of the Sava West National Park in Kenya, I know it's normally branded as the theater of the wild, meaning that it has all the possible fauna of interest that the tourists will want to see. The big five are normally there, and then talk about various also wildlife are normally found there because it's a theater of the wild, because it's a very big kind of a national park. So we expect to find as many fauna, as many flora as possible, and this automatically makes it to be called the theater of the wild. We have the National Environmental Management Authority, NEMA. NEMA, I know it's a very important institution in Kenya. And one thing, it was established through Environmental Management and Conservation Act. And it has what type of responsibility? One, it is to ensure that we have supervision and coordination on all matters concerning environment. And that's why I talked about environmental impact assessment, that the ones who carry it out, and then if a project is not viable or it's dangerous or harmful, they automatically will cancel out any kind of permit to this kind of an activity. If it is mining or something that is concerned about a project that automatically is normally carried out in the environment. And then it is also important, it's an important institution that normally aids in coming up with policies and implementation of the same policies that normally gear towards environmental protection as well as environmental management. The National Museums of Kenya. The National Museums of Kenya, it was established by the National Museum and Heritage Act. And the role of the National Museums of Kenya is to ensure that we have the role of the aspect about identity of culture, protection of culture, and then conservation and even transmission of culture and natural heritage of Kenya to the people of Kenya, and even to the generations to come, that is after in the years to come. Also today, the National Museums of Kenya plays a very, very important role in species monitoring and taxonomy. And for that reason, if you go to the National Museums of Kenya, you normally find the Department of Herpetology. It has a list and even specimen showing the types of species found in Kenya and their habitat and the conservation status. So they become important in the area of species monitoring and taxonomy. So I can also talk about preservation, even preservation aspect and education. They become also important in that area, that is the National Museums of Kenya. We also have the Kenya Forest Research Institute, and the function that is carefree. And from the word research, it is an institution that is mandated under the Science and Technology Act, Chapter 250 of Kenya, to do the functions of research, to do all aspects, to do the aspects of research in the area of forestry and any other area that automatically inclined to natural resource. And then we also have, it plays a role in influence in coming up with policies and also influence policies around that automatically will ensure we have forest resource management. It also has the mandate to conduct forest research in Kenya, as well as disseminate the findings they get from the research, and then cooperate with the other institutions or other research bodies that are doing similar research, especially that is geared towards forestry, or talk about forest conservation. So they also establish partnership with other organizations in the area of training and the area of forestry in Kenya, that is the Kenya Forest Research Institute. Now we also have the Kenya Forest Services. We say this was established through the Forest Act of 2005. And one thing I like to say is this Kenya Forest Service, just like Kenya Wildlife Service, is a parastatal, and it was established in February 2007. And this automatically came in to succeed the former Forest Department under the Ministry of Environment and Natural Resource, that is in 2005, based on the Act 2005 of the Forest Act. And what is the main function of the Kenya Forest Service? Number one, conserving and managing of forests to ensure that there's an increase in forest cover And then number 2, policy formulation and the implementation concerning aspects about forest management, forest conservation, forest utilization, so that this automatically is done in a way that we have a sustainable utilization without destruction of this forest in the country. And then it also manages all state forests. It protects these forests, and then it promotes forest education and training to the institution that are geared towards forestry or forestry management. Then I like to mention very, very important institution. I call it International Union for the Conservation of Nature, that is IUCN. Now I like to talk about IUCN because it's an international body that has influenced a lot in the area of conservation, and amphibians not left aside in this area. In fact, it looks at all the flora and fauna in the world. So let's look at IUCN. IUCN was established in 1948, and one aspect about its headquarters is in Gland, that is Switzerland. And then it has members. Membership in IUCN is characterized by various countries, various non-governmental organizations, scientists, volunteers that normally come in to fulfill the mission of IUCN. What is the mission of IUCN? When it was established, the key mission of IUCN is to influence, encourage, assist societies throughout the world to conserve nature and to ensure that the natural resources are being used in a very sustainable and a very equitable manner because of the profit that normally come out of these natural resources. Now, what are the roles of IUCN? What are the roles of IUCN? What are the roles of IUCN? Now, the roles of IUCN, we have number 1. It is number 1 international institution that normally gears or looks at aspects about nature conservation. And then we have sustainability of the use of these natural resources that are normally looked at in terms of conservation. And then number 2 is all about doing research and collecting data that aid in the area of education. So I can say it's all about research and getting analysis about flora and fauna, and this automatically is made possible through getting research, doing the analysis, doing projects, doing advocacy, so that they normally lobby in a particular country, for example, if there is a particular kind of a need of conservation. Now that is now where the IUCN comes in to ensure that there's proper education, there's proper lobbying to ensure that there's conservation of the talk about habitat plus the fauna and the flora in it. So talk about IUCN. IUCN also looks at sustainable. Today it has focused. It normally focuses on sustainable development projects that normally aid to assist even the community around to see the need to conserve and not to destroy. And then it also influences actions of government, talk about and other stakeholders that are normally intertwined with the resource that is found there, so that what they normally do, if there's a particular kind of a practice in a given kind of a country that automatically is causing threat to the survival of the amphibians or any other flora and fauna, that is when IUCN comes in to try and advise the government on the corrective measure, or in the long run, if they don't do that, what will happen is that this will cause a demise or the destruction, or talk about the disappearance of this of these species. Very, very important. Also, the IUCN is also important in the area of publishing and compiling very, very important list called the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. The Red List of Threatened Species. Very, very important. This automatically helps us tell us about the conservational status of various flora and fauna in the world. So that if a particular kind of a species is under threat, then action can be done so that we can prevent an element of extinction. And through this red list of threatened species, it automatically tells us about the categories that we get among the amphibians with respect to their conservation status, so that a country can take charge. Even the conservationists there they can take charge and ensure that the demise of this kind of an amphibian it doesn't come to pass. So talk about the IUCN Red List. And then one aspect about IUCN, it is also an observer and a consulting agency, especially together with the United Nations, especially in the areas about implementation of conventions. These are the international agreements, as well as ensuring that there are normally also participants in this talk about establishment as well as implementation, as per what the members agreed to do, as per what the treaty says. So they become observer and consultants in the working together with the United Nations to ensure that these international conventions, they're not taken for granted, but they're implemented as per those people who signed or the signatories of this type of a treaty. They also are involved in the establishment of Worldwide Fund for Nature, an organization, an NGO that was established to monitor, coordinate, talk about activities that automatically surround species survival and habitat conservation, that is throughout the world. And then they also established World Conservation Monitoring Center. This is to monitor the species statuses in various parts of the world. I've mentioned IUCN Red List. This is what I want to finish up by talking about. That is the IUCN Species Red List. This was established in 1964. And the key intention why it was established is to tell us about the status of various species in the world and bring to attention those that are under threat of disappearing, those that are moving towards an area of almost moving to extinction. So based on that, we shall look at the criteria that they came up with respect to the IUCN Red List, and possibly shall look at examples that are found under this, based on the amphibians as examples. Now, one aspect about the IUCN Red List. This Red List, it was established to tell us about various risks surrounding the species and subspecies, and this type of Red List becomes a very important tool. Automatically to tell us about the biological diversity status all over the world. And one aspect about the Red List becomes a very powerful tool because this list is established after thorough research has been done, and for that reason scientists are also involved in the process, and also volunteers. They go to the ground, do a research, and then at the end of it all they give a feedback about their status, and then they automatically note areas that need serious attention concerning conservation interventions. So let's look at the categories, starting from the most risky and then move towards other levels where not very risky. Now the first most dangerous category is extinct species. When we talk about extinct species, these are species that have not been seen for the last half a decade or the last 50 years, or in simple terms, they have disappeared or they have been terminated out of the face of the world. And this automatically is a very dangerous category. Now, examples of the amphibians that have been phased out because of various causal factors, and the extinction doesn't come. What normally brings about extinction? Extinction automatically comes about because of various factors that normally interplay to cause a reduction rather than a sustainable increase of a particular kind of a species. Now, if you look at the examples that we have here, like the Yunnan Lake newt, the Ainson's Worth salamander, the aquatic salamander, the green-flecked salamander, the Quito, stub-foot toad, And then if you look at the long-nosed stab-foot toad, the golden toad, the Collins poison dart frog, the Osgood's Ethiopian toad, all of these have disappeared. And if you look at the causal factors, most of these factors that have caused the decrease in these amphibian species, we have habitat destruction and fragmentation. We can have human factor. In fact, human factor is the key factor that has caused the decrease of these species because of overexploitation. Talk about over-harvesting, for example, and then talk about aspects like drainage of the water bodies where these amphibians are found due to habitat fragmentation, and this automatically has made these to disappear out of the face of the world. And then we have number 2, extinct in the wild. Extinct in the wild. When we talk about extinct in the wild, we find that if you look at these individuals, they are not found in free living kind of environments, but they can only be found in captive, or talk about in cages where they're normally captured, or talk about in confined kind of areas for their protection, so that at least they can possibly sustain themselves and then reproduce again. But if you go to the free living world, they're not found, meaning that they only survive in the captive states, maybe in confined areas where their population is monitored and it is normally protected. Examples include the Wyoming toad, the Chiansis spray toad. These are the examples of extinct in the wild amphibian species. Number 3, critically endangered species. Now this one they normally face extreme high risk of extinction in the immediate future. Meaning what? They'll become extinct if care is not taken, or any kind of factor surrounding them is not controlled or not removed from them. Now, examples include the Chinese giant salamander. You have the admirable false brook salamander, orphan salamander. We have the Montesi brook newt. You have the Chinhai spin newt, Lodger water frog, Titicaca water frog. These are the examples of the amphibians that are facing that kind of a category. Then you have endangered category. This one faces high risk of extinction in the near future, according to IUCN. And examples include the Inyo Mountains salamander, Alvarado salamander. These automatically are under the order Apoda. And then you have snail, we have the swordtail newt, you have the Anderson crocodile newt under the order Caudata. And then you have the Amable Maria frog. Then you have Hanchuko water frog. We have the western leopard toad, the Tai toad, Sagana, Sicilian, Taita, African, Sicilian. I know this one is found in Kenya. These automatically are under the endangered category. And I've mentioned the causal factor. They still interplay. Habitat fragmentation. We have predation, overpredation, that normally it overshoots the sustainable reproduction. This automatically can make them to become endangered in that process. We have vulnerable species. This one faces high risk of extinction in the medium term. That is, if this care is not taken, they automatically become extinct and even endangered in the years to come. Examples include the Tamaulipan Falls Brook salamander, the Kings River salamander, the yellow spotted newt, Kaisa newt. We have the Olympic torret salamander. We have the Chile water frog. We have the Ancash water frog. We have the H-World's toad. We have the Cape Mountain toad. These belong to vulnerable category. We have number 6, near threatened species. These, if care is not taken, they become threatened in the near future. And the examples include the green salamander, clouded salamander, the Taliag, Nobi newt, the striped newt, the Eilin's rubber frog, the Coundle rubber frog, the Togo toad, southwestern toad. These belong to near threatened category. And then number 7, least concern. Now these ones have no problem in conservation because their population is sustainable, meaning they are normally in large numbers. So for this one, they have no risk of maybe becoming extinct or becoming endangered, simply because their number is sustainable. They have a high or large population. Examples include the upper Amazon Sicilian, the Pastaza River Sicilian, the Japanese firebelly newt, Oriental firebelly newt, the common mud puppy, the two-toed amphibia, the three-toed amphibia, the Eupima shield frog. We have the Guyana shield frog, the Asmara toad, and then we have the Blandford's toad. We have data deficient category. Now you find that these ones, you find that they don't have sufficient information so that IUCN can categorize them and maybe put them under a given kind of a category. And one aspect about this, it does not mean that they're under threat. They can be under threat, but one aspect is that the information about them is not yet supplied so that proper assessment of the status can be made. Examples include, we have the Quetzalcoatl salamander, the hollow slender salamander, the Hall's water frog, the Alipaka water frog. We have the Bucco olongensis. We have the varying toad. We have the Zamda toad, Phylus Sicilian, and Victoria Sicilian. These ones belong to data deficient. And then we have category number 9, not evaluated. Now these ones are normally categorized. They have not yet been assessed. This one have not been assessed. And one aspect about this category is a category that automatically does not mean they're not at risk, but simply studies are being carried out so that at the end of it all, these species can be categorized. Then you have threatened, the term threatened. The term threatened, automatically, it generalizes, it combines a combination of species under the critical, endangered, and vulnerable category. So threatened species fall under that category. And then I've also like to talk about commercially threatened species. Commercially threatened species. Now if you look at these species, why do we call them commercially threatened? It is simply because these are normally considered as sustainable commercial resource in their day-to-day lives, meaning that they're normally utilized or they're normally consumed because of commercial purposes. But you find that according to the category, they are not endangered nor threatened. However, whatever that is happening around them, this kind of a commercial or a trade that is going on around them, or maybe making them to be involved into, automatically normally puts them at risk, and this automatically causes the reduction of their population. Now, if you look at most of the factors that interplay commercially threatened, they can either be utilized as pets, others are normally taken as pets, and then we have others, you find that they're normally utilized. Like if you look at the African cloud frog and the larval eastern tiger salamander, these ones are normally considered important types of amphibians for experiments and research. So most of them are normally harvested for research, and this automatically poses a threat onto that. And then if you look at Oriental fire-bellied toad, Japanese fire-bellied toad, you find that most of them, they're normally collected, and then they're normally imported to other kind of countries because of the products that they normally produce. Like if you look at the Japanese fire-bellied newt, they normally produce toxins that are normally harvested, and this reduction through harvesting has really caused their numbers to reduce. And that's why I'm saying whatever kind of an activity that's taking place around the habitats and around their lives that are, where they're normally involved, it causes their reduction. Hence, these normally put them to be under high kind of a risk. And then you have rare species. Now these are normally uncommon. The numbers are few, meaning that they're not very abundant. However, this situation of low kind of numbers and them being scarce normally puts them to be under high kind of a risk. So those are the categories. Thank you for listening to me. That is the end of our lesson. Thank you very much.
These televised lectures supplement our robust online learning going on our MKU online platform. You can view more on our televised lectures via our online platform. We are in a digital era, and Mount Kenya University knows this. The following are the steps to follow so as to complete your online application. Download the application form from the website www.mku.ac.ke. Attach copies of your academic certificates and ID. Pay the application fees via M-Pesa pay bill number 270988. Your ID is the account number. 2,000 shillings is the charge for a postgraduate. You can also deposit in the bank accounts provided on the website. Then email all the above to apply@mku.ac.ke.